Wyoming Territory, September of 1883. Agnes Morrow had learned somewhere in the long middle of her life that silence could fill a house the same way water fills a well. Slowly at first, then all at once, until you stopped noticing that the house was full of it and started believing that this was simply how a house was meant to feel. She stood on the porch of Morrow Draw Ranch in the last light of a September evening and counted the things that were not finished. The gate on the barn leaned 2 inches to the left, which meant the bottom hinge was pulling loose from wood that had softened through too many wet springs. The well rope had worn a groove into the lip of the stone housing, and every time someone drew water, the rope cut a little deeper into that same groove, and one morning before too long, the rope would simply give. The north wall of the cattle barn had taken on a particular gray color that Agnes knew without needing to look closely meant that the caulking between the boards had dried and cracked and was letting the cold in. Samuel had always finished those things before first light. He was the kind of man who woke before the birds and went to bed after the stars were well established, and in 31 years of marriage, Agnes had never once had to tell him what needed doing. He simply saw it. He moved through this land the way water moves toward low ground, finding every weakness, filling every gap. Samuel Morrow had been dead for 4 years. The gate, the rope, and the wall had been waiting for him ever since. Agnes rested her hand on the porch railing and let her eyes move across the yard. The garden fence sagged on the western side. The smokehouse roof needed 3 new shingles on the north corner. The pasture fence along the creek was pulling east, which meant the ground beneath 2 or 3 posts had gone soft, probably from a slow seep nobody had bothered to trace. Every unfinished repair sat exactly where she had last looked at it, unchanged, patient, in the way that only problems can be patient. She was 72 years old, and she had spent 4 years learning how to be alone. Then Copper stood up. The dog was old. He was a red and brown hound with a left rear hip that had stiffened 3 winters ago and never quite loosened again. And he moved with the particular dignity of an animal who had decided that pain was simply part of the terms of existence. He had been lying at the far corner of the porch in his usual spot, the place he had chosen the day Samuel died, and had not once abandoned since. He slept there. He ate there. He was there when Agnes went to bed, and there when she rose a steadiness she had come to rely on without ever saying so. Now he was standing facing the gate, ears forward, making a sound low in his chest, not a bark, not alarm. Something quieter than either. Agnes looked toward the gate. The light was going fast. The hills to the west had swallowed the sun and left behind a thin strip of orange that was already fading to gray. In that light, she saw a woman come through the gate with 2 children close beside her. Agnes did not move from the railing. She had learned in a life that had given her reason to learn it that people who arrived before a storm were usually carrying one of 2 things: trouble or bad news, sometimes both. The woman walked without hurrying. That was the first thing Agnes noticed. Most people who arrived at a ranch in the last minutes of daylight were hurrying even if they tried to hide it. This woman did not try to hide anything and did not hurry. She walked as someone walks who has been walking a long time and has made peace with the fact that hurrying changes nothing about distance. The older child was a boy, 11 or so, carrying a small wooden box pressed against his chest with both arms the way you carry something breakable or something that matters more than anything breakable. The smaller child was a girl no more than 6, moving alongside her mother with her eyes half closed. Not sleeping, just too tired to keep her eyes all the way open. The woman stopped at the foot of the porch steps. She was 34, Agnes guessed. The sun had been at her for months. Loose strands of chestnut hair had pulled free of her bonnet. She was not a large woman, but she stood the way a woman stands who has spent years standing without anyone to stand beside her. Her chin came up before she spoke. It was not a gesture of pride. It was the habit of someone who had learned to hold her head level even when everything else was falling. Please let us stay. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiest thing about her at that moment. Agnes looked at the woman's face for a few seconds. Then she looked at her hands. The knuckles were cut in the way that happens when cold and dry air crack skin that is already worn thin from work. The nails were short and clean in the manner of someone who works with their hands every day and takes the 10 seconds required to clean them, because clean hands are a matter of self-respect, not vanity. The palms, what Agnes could see of them, were calloused along the inside of each finger, which meant she had been gripping tools for years, not weeks. These were not the hands of someone asking for something they had not earned. Agnes looked at the woman's boots. The leather was cracked across the toe of the left one, and the right heel had worn nearly through. But someone had replaced the laces recently with new cord clean and tightly knotted. You did not replace the laces on boots you were planning to leave behind. Copper walked to the edge of the porch, descended the 2 steps slowly on account of his hip, and moved to where the small girl stood. He put his nose to her hand. She did not reach for him, too tired for even that much, but her fingers opened slightly. Copper turned around, once lay down beside her feet, and put his head on the ground with a long exhale. Agnes watched this. Copper had not done that with a stranger in 4 years. Not once. "What are your names?" Agnes said. "Eleanor Vane." The woman rested her hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is Caleb." She touched the girl's hair gently. "And this is Ruth. What happened to your husband?" The question landed in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor Vane did not flinch and did not look away. "He rode into a flooded wash trying to save 2 head of cattle. The cattle came home." She paused for one breath. "He didn't." The boy Caleb lowered his eyes to the wooden box. Ruth pressed closer to her mother's side without lifting her face from where it was nearly resting against Eleanor's arm. There were no tears from any of them. The road Agnes understood had already taken those. Agnes came down the steps. She stopped in front of the boy and looked at the box. "What are you carrying, son?" Caleb opened the lid. Inside, wrapped carefully in a piece of clean cloth, was a notebook, its cover soft with handling and dark at the corners from years of use. "My father's ranch book," the boy said. "He wrote down everything he learned. I promised I'd never leave it behind." Agnes looked at the notebook for a moment. Then she closed the lid with 2 fingers gently, the way you close something that deserves to be closed gently. She turned and walked back up the steps and across the porch to the front door. "I don't keep charity here," she said without turning around. "I keep work." She opened the door wide. "If your hands match your words, you'll earn every meal under this roof." Eleanor Vane stepped forward, but before she crossed the threshold, she stopped. It was such a small pause that someone not paying attention might have missed it. Eleanor's eyes moved across the yard in a single slow sweep, not admiring, not uncertain, but reading. The way a carpenter reads a wall before touching it, the way a doctor reads a face. Then she turned to Agnes. "The fence along the creek is pulling east," she said. 3 or 4 posts. The ground beneath them has gone soft." She did not point. She did not need to. Her eyes moved to the barn, the north wall of the cattle barn. "That color on the boards means the caulking has failed. You're losing heat through there all winter." Her eyes found the well, and the rope on your well is cutting into the same groove every time it's lifted. Before long, it'll fail without warning. Agnes stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame. "My husband taught me to watch the small things," Eleanor said. "He used to say that ranches don't disappear all at once. They disappear one repair at a time." Agnes Morrow went very still. She had heard those words before. Not words like them, not the same sentiment expressed differently. Those precise words in that precise order, spoken by a man's voice in summer light 30 years ago, standing on this very ground looking at this very fence. Samuel had said that to her the first week they had worked this land together. He had said it more than once over the years that followed, but the first time was what she remembered. The first time anything is said is the time that stays. Agnes kept her face composed. She had lived long enough to understand that some moments require composure the way a dam requires stone. She turned and went inside. Eleanor Vane followed with her children. Behind them, the wind moved through the empty yard. The orange strip on the western hills was gone now. The sky above the ridge had deepened to a blue so dark it was nearly black. Somewhere to the north, beyond sight, the first cold of the coming season was already moving. Morning arrived wrapped in frost. The grass was silver and stiff and crunched under boots. The sky was pale gray in the east and still dark in the west, and the line between the 2 colors was moving as it always did in only one direction. Agnes rose before full light as she had risen every morning for 50 years. She put on the kettle and went to the window that faced the barn. Eleanor Vane was already there. She had crossed the yard without waking anyone, or if she had made sound, the sound had not been enough to disturb 2 exhausted children. She was standing just inside the open barn door, and she was doing something that Agnes found herself watching with attention. She was standing still. She was not surveying the space the way visitors surveyed it, looking for things to comment on. She was looking at it the way a person looks at a problem they have been handed. Her eyes moved along the roof beams down to the floor across to the feed bins, along the walls where pale threads of coming daylight slipped through narrow cracks. She was making a record in her mind of every place where the barn was telling the truth about itself before she touched a single thing. Good ranchers watch before they act. Samuel had said that too. Agnes watched a little longer. Then she went back to her kettle. Inside the house, Caleb Vane had already pulled on his boots. He had done it quietly enough that his sister, asleep on the narrow cot near the stove, had not stirred. He came into the kitchen and looked at Agnes with a directness that reminded her unexpectedly of certain men she had known, men who had the quality of meeting your eyes without challenge and without apology, simply because they had decided that looking away was a form of dishonesty. "Is there something I should start on?" he said. Agnes pointed to the two empty buckets beside the back door. The well was a short walk from the house. Agnes watched from the kitchen window as Caleb crossed the yard. He found the rope and began to pull. She could see even from the window that the rope gave him trouble. The groove it had worn into the stone housing caused it to catch on each pull, requiring him to jerk it slightly to free it, and each jerk sent a small shock through his arms and shoulders. His shoulders shook. He adjusted his grip, tightened his hold, and kept going. He filled the first bucket and set it down and filled the second and carried both back across the yard. He did not set either bucket down to rest on the way back. Agnes had known men twice his size and 3 times his age who would have set them down. She heard small sounds from the doorway and turned to find Ruth barefoot on the kitchen floor rubbing her eyes. The girl did not speak. She looked at Agnes, then at the window, then at the door. Agnes pointed to the coat on the hook beside the door, the smallest coat which had belonged to a grandchild who no longer visited often. Ruth put it on without being told it was for her. By mid-morning, the frost had lifted enough that the ground showed through in patches. Agnes had given Eleanor the north pasture fence as the first task. 40 yards of fence line, several posts leaning at different angles, one nearly pulled free of the ground entirely. Eleanor walked the line once before doing anything else. She crouched beside each troubled post and pressed her hand into the soil around the base, feeling what was there. Then she stood and said to Caleb, who had followed with the toolbox, "The ground is giving way. Rainwater has been collecting here for years. Go find 2 flat stones, wide ones, bring them here." Caleb looked at her, then at the ground around the post, and then he looked at the post itself. He opened the wooden box and took out the notebook. For a moment, Agnes thought the boy was going to consult something already written there, but instead he took out a small pencil and opened to a page near the back and began to draw. He drew quickly, his eyes moving between the post and the paper. He drew the post, the angle of it, and then he drew the line of the ground and showed with a few strokes where the soft earth was and where the water must be collecting beneath the surface. Eleanor looked up from the post at the drawing. She went still for a moment. "Did your father draw that?" she said quietly. "No," Caleb said. "I did, from what I remember him doing." Eleanor looked at this drawing a few seconds longer, then back at the post. The drawing was close to right. Not exactly right, but close in a way that took years of careful watching to achieve. They brought the flat stones. They packed them beneath the base of the failing post before resetting it, adding fresh soil above the stone in firm layers, then braced it with a support post driven at an angle. The wire stretched tight along the repaired section. When they were done, the fixed portion of fence stood straighter than the untouched sections to either side of it. Agnes, who had ridden out to observe from horseback, without saying so, in so many words, brought her horse alongside the repaired section and looked at it for a moment. "You've done this before," she said. Eleanor was coiling the leftover wire. "My husband believed every repair should outlast the first one." Agnes said nothing in return. She looked at Caleb, who was writing in the notebook again, head bent, making a record of what they had done and how. A boy of 11 making a record of what his father's method looked like when it was applied to a problem his father had never seen. That evening after supper, Agnes sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time after the lamp was the only light. She opened Samuel's ranch ledger to no particular page and rested her hand on it, not reading it, just resting her hand on it the way you rest your hand on something that matters. She was not a sentimental woman, or at least she had not permitted herself to be one since Samuel died. Sentiment was something she associated with people who had the luxury of being still, and Agnes had not been still in 4 years, because when she stopped moving, she could hear the silence too clearly. She sat with the ledger. For the ledger and listened to the house breathe around her. 3 rooms away in the narrow cot, Caleb Vane was sitting up in the dark with his father's notebook open in his lap. Agnes could not see him. She could not know this for certain. But later, when she thought back on that first week, she would remember the small light that had moved beneath the door of that room and the way it had stayed burning long after Ruth had fallen asleep. The fourth day brought Reverend Crawford. He came on horseback just before noon, which was his custom. He was 60 years old with a broad forehead and the kind of steady, deliberate manner that came from decades of telling people things they needed to hear. He was not a cruel man. He had never been cruel, but he occupied a particular position in the valley, which was the position of a man who understood himself to be the voice of the community's conscience, and who took that responsibility with the full weight of someone who had never once questioned whether it belonged to him. Agnes let him in and put the kettle on. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted the tea she poured and asked after the fence repairs he had seen on his way in, and then he set his cup down and said what he had come to say. Agnes, I understand the impulse toward kindness. I want you to know that, but I have to speak plainly because I am your friend. He paused in the way that men pause when they have practiced what they are about to say. A woman traveling alone with 2 children, no papers, no family in the territory, no one who can vouch for her. That is a particular kind of person. I am not saying anything against her character. I am saying that you do not know her character, and at your age and alone here, that is not a small thing. Agnes poured her own tea. There is a family in Laramie, Crawford continued. Good people. They have taken in children before in situations where the mother's circumstances were uncertain. If Mrs. Vane is unable to provide what the children need, or if her situation becomes a burden on you that you did not anticipate, it would be a Christian act to consider the children's welfare separately from their mother's situation. Agnes set down the kettle. Samuel always said, she said carefully, that you learn more from a person's hands than from their papers, Reverend. You are welcome to look at hers. Crawford looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his cup and finished his tea. He stood, put on his hat, and said that he hoped she would give the matter thought. His voice was gentle and his face was composed, and he had not said a single unkind word. He went out to his horse and rode back down the lane. Agnes stood at the window and watched him go. She heard the floorboard behind her, the one at the kitchen doorway that had creaked since the second winter they were in this house. She did not turn around. Eleanor had come in for water. She had heard. Agnes did not ask what she had heard or how much of it. Eleanor set her cup on the counter and picked up the water bucket and went back outside. She did not say anything, and she did not look at Agnes as she passed. But she did not eat at noon. Agnes noticed this. She watched from the kitchen window as Eleanor went back to work on the caulking around the base of the barn's north wall, pressing the mixture into the gaps with a flat tool, moving along the boards steadily and without pause. And she understood that Eleanor Vane was the kind of woman who, when she was hurt by something, worked harder rather than less. Agnes had known women like that. She had been one most of her life. That afternoon, Silas Tanner arrived with a wagon loaded with fence posts. He was a compact, unhurried man of 48 who had ranched the land south of Morrow Draw for 20 years, and he operated on the principle that talking about work was a lesser form of doing it, and so he did not talk much. He climbed down from the wagon, noted Eleanor and Caleb working along the eastern fence line, and stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets. "They yours," he said to Agnes. "They're earning their keep," Agnes said. Silas nodded once and began unloading posts. An hour later, while Silas was stacking posts near the barn, Walter Griggs rode in. Walter Griggs owned the largest spread in the valley and had owned it for 22 years. And in those 22 years, he had formed a set of opinions about how things were to be done on a working ranch in Wyoming that had calcified into something resembling laws. He was 55 broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been made angular by sun and cold, and the particular expression of a man who believed he had earned the right to his opinions through the suffering required to arrive at them. He brought his horse to the fence where Eleanor was pressing a mixture of clay and straw into a crack in the barn wall. He sat in the saddle and looked at what she was doing. He smelled it. "That's hill clay," he said. "Mixed with dry straw and some horse dung," Eleanor said, without pausing or looking up. "Same mixture the Crow used on their winter lodges for generations. It dries harder than the wood beneath it." Walter looked at Silas. "She's going to winterproof Agnes Morrow's barn with Indian tricks," he said. Silas did not smile. He crouched beside the section of wall that Eleanor had treated 2 days earlier and pressed his thumb into it. His thumb did not leave a mark. He straightened up and put his hands back in his pockets. Walter waited for Silas to say something. Silas did not say anything. Walter turned in the saddle toward Agnes, who was watching from near the barn door. Agnes? His voice shifted. It was no longer dismissive. It was something else, something that cost him a little more to say. You have run this ranch for 30 years. You and Samuel built something here that means something in this valley. I would hate to see someone come in and start making decisions about what was right and what was wrong with the way Samuel did things. You don't need that. This place doesn't need that. It was a more careful argument than his first one. Agnes recognized it as such. She looked at the barn wall where Eleanor had been working. She looked at the section already dried and smooth. She looked at the eastern fence line where Caleb was helping Eleanor stretch wire, and at Ruth, who had come out to watch and was now carrying a small bundle of dry straw from the pile to where Eleanor was working, going back and forth without being asked, making herself useful in the only way available to her. Samuel built this ranch to last Walter, Agnes said, not to stand still. Walter held her gaze for a moment. Then he gathered his reins and turned his horse. He rode to the gate and through it and down the lane. At the bend before the cottonwoods took him from sight, he looked back. Agnes saw it. It was a look she had not seen on Walter Griggs' face before. Not contempt, not the satisfaction of a man who is sure of himself. Something nearer to discomfort, which in Agnes's experience was the first useful thing that happened in anyone's thinking. Silas waited until the sound of Walter's horse had faded, then walked to where Agnes was standing. Agnes. He spoke without preamble in his usual way. His north wall. I rode past Griggs's place last week. He paused. It's worse than he lets on, a lot worse. Agnes said nothing for a moment. She looked down the lane where Walter had gone. The man who had just stood in her yard and called Eleanor Vane's work Indian tricks had a cattle barn with a north wall that was failing. Badly enough that Silas had noticed it from the road and thought to mention it. Agnes understood what that meant. She had ranched long enough to understand it completely. I see, she said. Silas nodded and went back to stacking posts. The light was going when Agnes walked back into the house. She paused in the doorway of the room where the children slept. Ruth was already in bed, her breathing slow and even. Caleb was sitting up, the notebook open across his knees, a candle on the floor beside him. He was reading something near the back of the book, and the way he was reading it was not the way you read something new. It was the way you read something you have read before, measuring yourself against it. He heard Agnes and looked up. He closed the notebook and held it in his lap. There's a page near the end, he said. My father wrote it before he died. He was quiet for a moment. He said I'd know when to show it. Agnes looked at him. Do you know yet? Caleb considered the question with the seriousness that some children bring to serious questions. Not yet, he said, but I think it's getting close. Agnes reached in and turned down the wick on the candle until it went out. Then you'll know when you know, she said, and pulled the door to. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. Outside, the wind had begun to build. Not the ordinary September wind that came down from the mountains each evening and meant nothing. This wind had a quality to it, a particular bite that did not belong to September, that belonged to October at the earliest and more properly to November. The grass in the yard was moving in a way that made Agnes think of water running fast. She was still sitting at the table when Eleanor came in to tell her that Copper would not come inside. Agnes went to the porch door and called the dog's name. Copper was standing at the far edge of the porch facing north, ears forward, making no sound at all now. He did not come when she called. He did not look at her. Agnes stood in the doorway and looked at the northern sky. The stars that should have been visible were not visible. There was something over them, some thickness, though you could not yet call it cloud. Samuel had said more than once that old Copper knew weather better than any almanac published in the state. He had said it fondly, the way he said things he believed but knew could not be proven. Agnes looked at the dog for a long time. Then she went inside and put another log on the fire. She lay in bed that night and listened to the wind and thought about Samuel and about the woman in the next room who had said his words without knowing they were his words, and about a boy sitting in the dark reading the last pages of his father's notebook and waiting for the right moment to show them to someone. She thought about Walter Griggs' north wall and about the way Walter had looked back from the bend in the lane with an expression she had not seen on him before. She thought about what Reverend Crawford had said and about the family in Laramie who took in children whose mother's circumstances were uncertain. She thought about Eleanor Vane's hands, She fell asleep before she had thought her way through any of it, which was perhaps the wisest thing she had done all day, because some things do not benefit from being thought through all the way. Some things need to be slept on, first turned over in the dark, tested against the quality of your own silence, before you decide what to do about them. On the western ridge beyond, where she could see or know the first thin line of cloud had reached the mountains and was beginning to build. The haystack had been Samuel's idea. Agnes had always known this. She had known it the way you know the shape of furniture you have lived with for 30 years so well that you stop seeing it and simply move around it in the dark. Samuel had built that stack in the dry summer of 1871, positioned it against the western pasture fence to get it out of the way of the wagon path, and Agnes had not once in 12 years questioned the position because Samuel had chosen it. And questioning Samuel's choices after he was gone felt like a particular kind of disloyalty she had not permitted herself. Eleanor said nothing about the haystack for the first 10 days. On the morning of the 11th day, she walked around it twice in the pale October light, moving slowly, pressing the toe of her boot into the ground at the base of the stack on 3 different sides. Then she came to where Agnes was standing near the garden fence, and she looked at Agnes directly and said what she had observed. This stack faces the wrong direction. Every winter, the bottom layer takes water. Snow melts here first because of the wind pattern off that western fence, and the moisture climbs up into the hay from below. By February, you are feeding cattle hay that is half rotted at the core, and they are getting less from it than the weight suggests. Agnes looked at the stack. She had fed cattle from that stack through 11 winters, through blizzards that buried the fence posts and cold snaps that cracked the water troughs, and she had never once thought to question where Samuel had put it or why. He built it the year we had the dry summer, Agnes said. Her voice was level. It made sense then. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. The silence of someone choosing carefully. Most things that go wrong started out making sense, she said. Agnes stood with that for a long moment. It was not a cruel thing to say. It was not said cruelly, but it sat in the air between them with a weight that Agnes felt in her chest rather than her ears, because it was true in a way that extended far beyond haystacks. She turned and walked toward the barn without answering. They moved the stack that afternoon. Agnes and Eleanor and Silas Tanner, who had appeared at the gate around midday, with no particular explanation for why he had come, which was his way of saying that he had heard what needed doing and had come to help do it. They repositioned it against the southern fence, where the wind pattern was different and the drainage ran away from the base rather than toward it. Caleb carried stakes. Ruth moved armloads of loose hay that had scattered, working back and forth with the focused patience of a child who understands that small contributions matter. They were 3/4 done when a wagon slowed on the road above the pasture fence. Agnes looked up. Martha Griggs was on the wagon seat, holding the reins of a bay mare with the easy grip of someone who has held reins all her life. She was 50 years old with a square face and steady eyes, in the economical manner of a woman who had spent decades getting things done with whatever was at hand. She sat looking at the repositioned haystack for a moment. Then she looked at Eleanor. She did not get down from the wagon. She did not say anything about the stack, or about Eleanor, or about the rumors Agnes knew were traveling through the valley like weather, which was to say invisibly and in every direction at once. She said one thing. "You know anything about root cellars?" Eleanor straightened from the stake she was driving. "A few things." "Mine has been wrong since August," Martha said. "Maybe you would come and look at it sometime." She said it the way someone says a thing they have decided to say before they can talk themselves out of it. Then she clicked to the mare, and the wagon moved on down the road without waiting for an answer. Silas watched the wagon go. He said nothing. He drove the next stake himself. Agnes found the root cellar 2 days later. She did not go looking for a problem. She went down to check the onion count, which was a task she performed every 2 weeks through the fall, and she had her lantern and her counting list, and she was thinking about nothing in particular when she noticed the smell. It was a smell she knew. Every person who has kept a root cellar for more than a decade knows it. It was the smell of something going wrong underground, slow and dark and invisible until it was not invisible anymore. She stood at the bottom of the cellar stairs and held the lantern up. Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs behind her. Agnes had not heard her come across the yard, but she was not surprised. Eleanor had a quality of moving through space without announcing herself that Agnes had stopped noticing as strange and had begun to depend upon. "Come down," Agnes said. Eleanor descended. She took the lantern from Agnes without asking and moved it slowly along the shelves. She pressed her palm against the stone wall on the east side. She held her fingers near the narrow vent opening high on the west wall and then near the floor. She crouched and looked at the base of the lowest shelf. Then she took one potato from the far corner of the middle shelf and turned it in the light. She pressed one thumb gently into its side. The skin gave. She turned it over and pressed again. Then she held it out to Agnes. Agnes took it. The skin was intact on the outside. Inside, where she pressed it, gave the way a thing gives when the core has already gone. She looked at the corner of the shelf where Eleanor had taken it from. From the outside, the potatoes there looked the same as the others. Sound, firm, whole. She reached in and took another. Pressed it. The same. She counted quickly along that shelf. She moved to the shelf below. Her hands were working before her mind had fully arrived at the conclusion the way hands do when you have lived long enough that the body sometimes understands a problem before the mind gets there. A third of what she was looking at had already failed. Agnes set the potato down. She rested one hand flat on the cold stone shelf and stood with her back to Eleanor for a moment because some things you need a moment to absorb before you can look at another person. She had provisioned this cellar for one person through one Wyoming winter. She had made those calculations in August carefully the way she had made them every August for 30 years, and she had been satisfied with them. She had not remade them when 3 more people came through her gate. She had not said this to Eleanor. She had not said it to herself, not directly, not in words. She had simply proceeded, and this was what proceeding had produced. She turned around. Eleanor was looking at the vent opening near the ceiling. She reached up and held 2 fingers near it. Then she crouched and held 2 fingers near the base of the east wall. She stood and took the lantern from Agnes and moved it slowly around the room, watching the flame. "The air isn't moving," Eleanor said. She pointed to the vent above them. "This lets warm air out, but there's nothing pulling cool air in from below. The air sits. Moisture builds. Everything exposed to the outside wall takes it." She looked at the shelves against the east wall. That corner is the worst because it catches whatever the wall breathes, and the wall breathes because there is no circulation to keep it from having to. She took out the small piece of paper she kept folded in her coat pocket and a stub of pencil and drew the cellar quickly. Not a careful drawing, a working drawing. She marked the existing vent, the shelves, the walls, and then she drew what was needed. A second vent opening low on the east wall opposite the first burlap, hung between the stone wall and the shelf edge to create a buffer wood ash in the corners to pull moisture from the air. She handed the drawing to Agnes. 3 days, she said, maybe 4. Agnes looked at the drawing. Then she looked at the shelves again, at the third of her winter provisions that had gone wrong in the dark without her knowing. "All right," she said. They worked the following morning before breakfast. Caleb used a cold chisel to open the lower vent, while Eleanor directed the angle. The work was slow and loud in the enclosed space, and Ruth sat at the top of the stairs with her hands over her ears, watching through the opening with wide eyes. When the new vent was through, the air in the room shifted almost immediately, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way a room changes when you open a second window. Caleb pressed his face near the opening and reported that he could feel movement. Eleanor placed burlap between the east wall and the shelf edge. Ruth carried the wood ash down in small bowls one at a time on the stairs, setting each bowl carefully in the corners without spilling. Caleb measured the temperature each morning and evening with the old thermometer Agnes kept on the cellar shelf. He wrote the numbers in his father's notebook in a column beside the date. He did not need to be asked to do this. He was already doing it by the second morning. On the 4th day, the smell was gone. The walls were dry to the touch. The remaining potatoes were firm. Agnes stood alone in the cellar that evening after supper, with the lantern turned low. She touched the east wall with both hands, and she thought about Samuel, who had built this cellar with his own hands in the 2nd year they were on this land, who had mixed the mortar for these stones himself, who had known more about cold and frost and what the ground did to things you buried in it than anyone Agnes had ever met. Samuel had not known about the vent. He had not put one in. In 30 years of keeping this cellar, Agnes had never thought to question whether one was needed. She pressed her palms against the stone. The work had not been replaced. The walls were still his walls, still his mortar, still his proportions unchanged. It had simply been given another way to breathe. She stood there for a little while longer than she needed to. Then she went upstairs. On the ninth evening of the second week, Agnes could not sleep and came downstairs before midnight to find Caleb at the kitchen table. He had the notebook open to the last few pages. The candle was low. When he heard her on the stairs, he did not close the book, which Agnes took as a sign of something, though she was not certain what. She sat across from him. "The page near the end," she said. "Your father wrote it before he died." Caleb looked at her. He said, "I would know when it was time to show it." "Do you know yet?" Caleb thought about this with a seriousness that Agnes had come to expect from him. He did not give quick answers to questions that deserve slow ones. "I think it's getting close," he said. Agnes looked at the candle. "Your father, was he a man who was usually right about things?" Caleb considered the question. "About ranch things almost always. About people most of the time." He paused. "He said you only miss with people when you're trying to see what you want to see instead of what's there." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. Copper shifted somewhere on the porch, his nails on the boards, then settled again. "What was he trying to reach?" Agnes said. "In the wash, when he went in after the cattle." Caleb looked at her steadily. The cattle were already across. He could see them on the other bank. He went in to bring them back so they wouldn't keep moving north. He stopped. The bank on the other side had given way from the flooding. The cattle were standing in soft ground. He thought if he didn't cross to them, they'd try to move and go into deeper water. Agnes looked at the boy's face. He had told this story before. He had told it enough times that the telling of it had become something he could do without losing himself in it entirely. "He was trying to save them from a second problem," Agnes said. "Yes," Caleb said. "That was how he thought." Agnes put her hand briefly over his and then took it away. She stood and said goodnight and went back upstairs. She lay in the dark for a while thinking about a man she had never met, who had thought the same way her husband had thought, who had gone into a flooded wash to prevent a second disaster and had not come out, and whose son was sitting at her kitchen table waiting for the right moment to show her something the man had written down. Deputy Holt Sams arrived on a Thursday morning in the middle of October, which was 12 days after Eleanor and the children had come to Morrow Draw. He was 38, lean, with a careful face that gave away less than most faces did. He came on horseback, and he came alone, and he dismounted at the gate and tied his horse before he came any further, which Agnes noted. Men with bad intentions rarely tied their horses. He had papers, not a warrant, a notice of inquiry. He said which was a legal document filed with the county court in Clearwater. A man named Garrett Hollis in Cheyenne had filed a claim stating that Thomas Vane had died with a debt of $240 outstanding, and Hollis was asserting the right to recover against Thomas Vane's property, which he had described as including tools, equipment. And the language was specific. One ledger book described as a ranch record. Agnes was standing on the porch when Sams read this. Eleanor was in the yard 7 feet away, and she went completely still when she heard the words ledger book. Caleb was behind Eleanor. His left arm came across his body, and his hand found the wooden box on the hook inside the barn door, and he held it the way he had held it the night he arrived, pressed against himself, not hiding it, just keeping it. Agnes came down from the porch. "Deputy Sams," she kept her voice even, "that notebook belongs to a child. It is not an implement of trade. It is not equipment. It is not part of any estate. It is a boy's inheritance from his father." Sams looked at Agnes, then at Eleanor, then at Caleb. He was the kind of man who watched things before he spoke about them. "Ma'am, I'm delivering the notice as required. Mr. Hollis has 30 days to file a formal claim with the circuit court. And in those 30 days, Agnes said, this family is under this roof under my name, and I do not receive collectors at Morrow Draw. You go back to Clearwater and you tell Mr. Garrett Hollis that Agnes Morrow's name is on the deed to this land and has been for 31 years, and I do not receive collectors." Sams looked at her for a moment. Then he folded the copy of the notice and tucked it into his coat. "I'll convey that, ma'am," he said. He walked back to his horse, untied it, mounted, and rode back down the lane at the same steady pace he had arrived. Agnes watched him go without moving from where she was standing. Eleanor crouched in front of Caleb. She put one hand on the wooden box and looked at her son. "Is there anything in that book that a stranger would use against us?" Caleb held her gaze. He thought for a moment, taking the question seriously the way he took all serious questions. "There's something a stranger shouldn't see," he said, "but not the kind of thing Mr. Hollis is looking for." He looked at his mother. "Pa said I'd know when to show it. I'm not ready yet." Eleanor kept her eyes on his face for a moment longer. Then she said, Do you trust yourself to know? Pa said I would, Caleb said. So yes. Eleanor stood up and went back to work. Agnes stayed where she was, looking down the empty lane, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle around her. Garrett Hollis in Cheyenne, $240. A man dead in a flooded wash, and someone in a city office building who had figured out quickly enough that Thomas Vane could not dispute anything anymore. She went inside and put the kettle on because there was nothing else useful to do at that moment, and making tea was the one form of action that did not require anything from her except heat and patience, both of which she had. Walter Griggs came back on a Tuesday. He came early enough in the afternoon that he could not pretend it was a passing visit. He tied his horse at the fence with the deliberateness of a man who has decided on the way over what he intends to say and has organized it into a sequence. Agnes was in the barn when he arrived. She heard his voice first speaking to Eleanor in the yard, and she came out to the barn door and stood there listening. Last winter, Walter was saying, old Abram Holt tried something similar on his east wall, cracked through by February. Abram used river clay, Eleanor said. She was pressing a fresh section of the mixture into a gap at the base of the barn's east corner, working steadily. High silt content. It shrinks when it dries and cures. This is hillside clay. Walter looked at the section she had done 2 weeks ago. He could see that it had not cracked. The surface was uniformly hard smooth where she had worked it, and it had taken the frost of 2 cold nights without any visible change. Agnes could see him seeing this. She could see him registering it and deciding not to acknowledge it. Agnes, he turned from Eleanor. His voice had changed. You have known what you're doing on this land for 30 years. You knew it before Samuel died, and you have known it since. You don't need someone coming in and making decisions about which of Samuel's choices were wrong. That is not respect. That is not help. That is a stranger telling you that the man you built a life with didn't see clearly. He stopped. Samuel Morrow saw very clearly. Agnes looked at Walter. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor had not stopped working. She was pressing the mixture into the gap with the same steady motion she had been using, without hurrying and without pausing, the way someone works when they have learned to keep their hands moving, regardless of what is happening around them. Agnes looked out past Walter toward the barn, toward the haystack that had been moved 10 days ago and now sat properly angled against the south fence, its base dry on a morning when the old position would have been sitting in snowmelt. Then she looked back at Walter. Samuel built things to last, she said. Mom, everything he built lasted the way he expected. That is not a failure. That is time passing. She let that settle. He would have been the first to see it. You knew him well enough to know I'm right. Walter looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, something that was not quite what he had come here with. And Agnes recognized it because she had felt something similar herself in the past 2 weeks. A tightening followed by an opening. The sensation of something held too long, beginning to loosen. He looked at Silas, who had come around the corner of the barn at some point, and was standing with his arms folded, saying nothing. Walter nodded once minimally in Silas's direction. Then he got on his horse and rode out. When the sound of him had gone, Silas said, He'll look at that wall again before dark. I know, Agnes said. She went inside. Eleanor came in a few minutes later to wash her hands at the basin. Agnes had put water on without thinking about it. She set 2 cups on the table and poured. Eleanor dried her hands on the cloth by the basin and came and sat down. Neither of them said anything. Agnes wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, the wind had picked up since morning. Leaves from the cottonwoods along the lane were going sideways in it. Copper moved on the porch and settled again. Agnes became aware sitting there that she had not sat in this kitchen with another person, without something requiring to be done or said, in longer than she could easily remember. Since Samuel. Perhaps since before Samuel died, when the days had the quality of being full in both directions, full of what needed doing, and full of the person you were doing it alongside. Eleanor drank her tea. Agnes drank hers. Ruth's voice came from outside talking to someone, and after a moment, Agnes identified the someone as Copper, who did not answer but whose presence was apparently sufficient for the conversation. They sat there until the tea was gone. Then Eleanor stood and took both cups to the basin and rinsed them and went back outside. Agnes, however, stayed at the table another few minutes. She looked at Samuel's ledger on the shelf where it always sat, the one fixed thing in the kitchen she had not been able to move or put away. She looked at the door Eleanor had gone through. She thought about the way the kitchen had felt with 2 people in it and no task requiring either of them to do anything except be there. She had not felt that way in 4 years. She had almost forgotten that it was possible to feel it. Martha Griggs came on a Thursday morning 10 days before November, and this time she came deliberately. She tied her horse at the gate, which was different from pausing on the road. She came to the door and knocked, and when Agnes opened it, she said, "I thought I would come and see about that cellar question, if Eleanor has a moment." Eleanor was in from the barn within 10 minutes. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, and Martha described her cellar with the precision of someone who has been observing a problem carefully and has decided to stop managing it alone. Eleanor listened and asked questions: how the shelves were arranged, which wall got the most moisture, whether the door faced east or south, and what time of day the sun hit it. Martha answered each question without pause. She had clearly thought about all of it. She had simply lacked someone to think with. They were working through the second problem, the moisture along the north shelf, when Martha said, without looking up from the sketch Eleanor was drawing, "Walter has been looking at that barn wall of yours." Eleanor kept drawing. "I noticed. He won't say anything," Martha said. "He'll just do it." Eleanor said, "That's fine." Martha looked up then. She looked at Eleanor for a moment with an expression that Agnes could not entirely read, something between recognition and relief, the look of a woman who has found a conversation she did not know she had been needing. "He's a hard man to change," Martha said, "but he watches things. He has always watched things. He just needs to be sure he's seeing something real before he decides it matters." Eleanor said, "He's been sure for about a week." Agnes saw the corner of Martha's mouth move. By the time Martha left, the sketch of the cellar had 4 annotations in Eleanor's handwriting and a note about which stones on the north wall needed to be repointed before it got any colder. Martha folded it and put it in her coat and said she appreciated Eleanor's time. She said it to Eleanor, not to Agnes, which was its own kind of statement. Agnes walked her to the gate. "She knows what she's doing," Martha said. "She does," Agnes said. Martha untied her horse. She paused with her hand on the saddle before she mounted. "Walter and I lost 17 head in the February of '79, she said. "North wall failure?" She said it to the saddle, not to Agnes. "We were 3 years paying it back. I knew for 2 winters before that the wall was going." I told him. She mounted. She looked down at Agnes. He watched it fail before he believed it. She rode out. Agnes stood at the gate and watched until the horse had gone around the bend where the cottonwoods started. The sky to the west had been building all day in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary October clouds. These were stacked dark at the base, in white along the top edges, the kind that Agnes associated not with October, but with what came after October. The wind all week had been from the north, and it had grown each day since Monday, and today it had taken on a particular quality that Agnes recognized without being able to describe it in any scientific terms. It was simply the quality of a wind that has come a long way and is not finished traveling. She went back inside and found Caleb at the table with his father's notebook, the last few pages open. He looked up when she came in. "Agnes," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without being asked to. "I think I know when now." Agnes pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Outside, the first pieces of ice, so small you could not call them snow, yet small enough that you had to listen for them rather than look for them, began to tick against the window glass. Copper rose from the porch with the slow difficulty of an old body in cold weather and walked to the door and pressed his nose against the gap at the bottom of it, reading whatever the air outside was saying. He did not scratch to come in. He stayed at the door, nose against the wood, reading and reading. Caleb opened the notebook to the last page, smoothed it flat with his palm, and pushed it across the table to Agnes. Agnes read the page slowly. Not because the handwriting was difficult. Thomas Vane had written clearly in the deliberate hand of a man who was careful about being understood. She read slowly because certain things require you to slow down before you are ready to know them, and because she understood, before she had reached the third line, that this was one of those things. The entry was dated July of 1882. 14 months before the evening Eleanor had knocked on her gate. Thomas Vane had been riding a survey route through the Eastern Territory that summer, assessing grazing potential for a land trust he was hired to advise. He had come through the Morrow Draw Valley on a Wednesday afternoon and had stopped to ask directions from a man repairing a fence along the road. The man had been Samuel. Agnes sat with that for a moment. Samuel, 4 months before he died, repairing a fence along the road in the July heat, the way he had repaired things his entire life alone, and without announcement, and a stranger had stopped, and they had talked. Thomas had written that they talked for nearly an hour. He had written that in 30 years of moving through ranch country, he had not met more than a handful of men who understood land the way Samuel Morrow understood it, who could read what the ground was saying and what the wind was doing and what a fence post angle told you about the water table. He had written that Samuel had spoken about his wife, and Thomas had noted, because he noticed things and wrote them down, that when Samuel spoke about Agnes the way he did with the particular steadiness of a man who knows what he has and does not take it for granted, Thomas had thought about Eleanor and had felt something that he did not describe precisely, but that the word grateful came close to. And then at the bottom of the page in handwriting that was slightly different from the lines above it, written at a different time with a different pen, Thomas had added something. The ink was darker. He had come back to this page. Agnes read those lines twice. He had written, Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means Caleb showed you. If Caleb showed you, it means you found your way there. I want you to know that it was not an accident. Agnes Morrow will understand you in ways that take other people years. She will not say so. She does not say things like that. But she will know what you are doing and why, and in this world that is rarer than land. Stay as long as she will have you. Build something that lasts. That is all I have ever wanted for you, and I believe meeting Samuel Morrow on a July afternoon on a dirt road in Wyoming that I have found the place where it can happen. Agnes set the notebook on the table. She looked at Caleb, who was watching her with the careful attention of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally set it down and is waiting to see if the ground holds. She looked at the window. The ice pieces ticking against the glass had grown. They were snow, now small and dry and wind-driven, the kind that comes before the real weight arrives. She pushed the notebook back across the table to Caleb. "Give it to your mother," she said. Caleb picked up the notebook and went to find Eleanor. Agnes sat at the kitchen table alone. She put her hands flat on the wood and felt the grain of it beneath her palms, the table Samuel had built in the 3rd year on this land from timber he had milled himself. And she thought about 2 men who had never met again after a July afternoon on a dirt road, one of whom was dead and one of whom was dead, and the things they had each understood about the value of what they were building and the people they were building it with. She heard Eleanor's voice from the other room, not the words, just the sound of it going quiet in a particular way. Agnes got up and put more wood on the fire. By nightfall, the storm had arrived in a way that made everything that had come before it seem like preparation. The wind did not build gradually. It arrived at a speed that pressed against the barn doors and made the house timbers flex, and behind the wind came the snow, not the dry preliminary snow of early evening, but the real snow, heavy and horizontal, the kind that fills the air so completely that the barn was invisible from the house at 20 yards. Silas Tanner was already in the barn. He had shown up at the gate 2 hours before the storm's full arrival in his customary way of appearing, when he was needed without explaining how he had known to appear, and he had gone directly to work, checking every latch and brace without being directed. Eleanor moved through the barn in the lantern light, systematic and quiet. She went to each animal, checked each one, noted anything that wanted noting, and moved on. Ruth had come to the barn against Agnes's preference and was sitting on a hay bale with her back against the wall and a blanket around her, watching everything with the serious attention she brought to most things. Agnes had decided not to send her back because the barn was warmer than arguing about it. Caleb moved along the south wall with his lantern, writing in his father's notebook as he went. He wrote the cattle count, the condition of the water trough, the temperature according to the thermometer on the center post. He wrote the time. He wrote what the wind sounded like, which Agnes thought was not a practical notation until she considered that a boy who had lost his father to a flooded wash might have very specific reasons for wanting to remember what particular kinds of danger sounded like. The storm pressed against the north wall of the barn. Agnes stood in the center of the space and listened. She had stood in this barn through 30 years of Wyoming winters. She knew the sounds it made when it was holding and the sounds it made when it was not. She heard the wind find the north wall and push against it, find the resistance, push harder, and she heard what the wall said back. The wall held. Not with the groan and give of boards under stress, not with the whistle of cold air finding gaps, not with the particular sound of caulking that has failed and is about to fail further. It held with a solidity that was quieter than any storm Agnes had heard it resist before, because the gaps that had previously let the wind in to announce its presence were gone, and what remained was just the storm on the outside and the settled air on the inside, and between them, the wall doing its work without complaint. Caleb wrote in the notebook north wall held. November 28, 1883. He looked at the small clock he carried and wrote the time after it. Agnes noticed that he wrote it down before he said anything about it. He recorded it first and then looked up and found his mother's eyes across the barn, and Eleanor looked at the north wall and then back at her son, and neither of them said anything at all. They did not need to. It was nearly midnight when Copper, who had been allowed into the barn on account of the cold and was lying near Ruth's hay bale, stood up suddenly and looked at the barn door. 3 seconds later, someone knocked on it. Silas got there first. He pulled the door open against the wind, and Walter Griggs came through it, bringing the storm with him in a cold white blast that extinguished 2 of the 4 lanterns and set the cattle shifting and stamping. Walter was covered in snow from his hat to his boots. His beard had ice in it. His hands were shaking with a tremor that was not entirely cold, though cold was part of it. He was holding something under his coat with both arms. He stopped inside the door and looked around the barn until he found Eleanor. He looked at her with an expression that Agnes had never seen on Walter Griggs's face, and was not certain she had expected to see there something stripped of its usual armor, the face of a man standing in the wreckage of his own certainty. "My north wall gave way," he said. "I couldn't save the others." He opened his coat. The calf inside was newborn wet and small, its eyes closed, its sides barely moving. Nobody in the barn said anything about what Walter had said before this night. There was nothing to say about it that the calf in his arms did not already make obvious. Eleanor said, "Lay it there," and pointed to a clean section of straw near the south wall away from the drafts. Walter laid the calf down with a care that contradicted the size of his hands. He stepped back and stood there looking at it, his arms at his sides, and Agnes thought she had never seen a large man look so uncertain of where to put himself. Ruth was already moving. She had the blanket off her own shoulders before anyone asked her, and was settling it around the calf's body, tucking it in with the focused attention she applied to everything small that needed taking care of. Caleb had the water bucket on the small brazier in the corner before Eleanor had to say a word about it. Silas relighted the 2 lanterns and moved them closer. Eleanor worked on the calf without speaking. She worked with her hands and her attention and the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had helped enough newborn animals into the world to understand what they needed from a human being and what they needed from time. Agnes watched her and then looked at Walter, who was watching Eleanor with an expression that had moved past, stripped into something else, something that was going to take him a while to know what to do with. Agnes went and stood beside Walter. She did not say anything to him. She simply stood there, which was a thing she understood how to do, and which she suspected Walter needed more than conversation. He was a man who had been wrong in a way that had cost him something he could not recover. Agnes knew that particular weight. She had carried it in different forms. Standing next to someone while they carry it is not a small thing, even when nothing is said. They worked through the remaining hours of the night. The storm outside did not diminish. The snow continued to press against the barn walls and pile against the doors, and the wind continued to look for ways in and continued not to find them where it had always found them before. The north wall did not move. Just before 4 in the morning, the calf struggled and found its feet. It stood on 4 legs that had no confidence yet. Legs that had been in the world for only a few hours and were still deciding what they were for. It stood, and it breathed, and it did not fall. Walter Griggs watched this and said nothing for a very long time. His hands had stopped shaking. His face had settled into something Agnes recognized, not peace exactly, but the quality of a man who has arrived after a long road at the thing he needed to see. He got up from where he had been sitting on a hay bale and walked to the north wall. He put his palm flat against it. He pressed. He moved his hand along the surface, feeling the texture of what Eleanor had put there weeks ago, what had endured the worst night in 3 years of Wyoming winters without letting a single degree of warmth escape. He turned around. Eleanor was on the other side of the barn, refilling the water bucket. She had her back to him. "Mrs. Vane," Walter said. Eleanor turned. "Would you show me how you made this?" He asked it the way a man asks something he has been working his way toward for a long time, without decoration, without apology, the plain question finally arriving after everything that had to happen before it could be asked. Eleanor told him. She told him the proportions and the preparation and the timing and what to do when the first layer dried too fast and how to know when it was ready. She told him simply, without any edge in her voice, because she was not a woman who kept score. Walter listened without interrupting. He asked two questions, both practical, and Eleanor answered them. And by the time they were done, the two of them were standing at the wall together, looking at it the way two people look at a thing they have decided to take seriously. Dawn came gray and slow through the gaps in the barn door. The storm had not ended, but it had exhausted the worst of itself, the way storms do around first light, as though they too need to rest. Martha Griggs appeared at the barn door an hour after dawn. She had ridden through the tail end of the storm on a horse that must have trusted her considerably to agree to it. She came in and stood still for a moment, taking in the calf on its feet, in the straw, the lantern light, the people, the quiet. She looked at Walter. He met her eyes, and something passed between them that was between a husband and wife and not for anyone else to read exactly. Then Martha turned and looked at Agnes. Agnes, her voice was even. Whatever this woman asked for when she came to your door, I hope you said yes. She asked for a roof, Agnes said. I gave her work. Martha looked at Eleanor. Then she did something that Agnes had not anticipated. Martha Griggs, who was one of the most composed women in the valley, whose composure had been forged through 2 decades of Wyoming winters, and the specific hardship of being married to a man who watched things fail before he believed they needed fixing, put her hand over her mouth and stood there for a moment not speaking. She was not crying about the calf. Agnes understood this. She was crying about the February of 1879 and the 17 head they had lost. In the 3 years paying it back, and about the 2 winters before that, when she had known the wall was failing, and Walter had watched it fail before he believed her, and about the particular loneliness of being right and having no one who would listen. Agnes crossed the barn and put her hand on Martha's arm and stood there while Martha got through it. Martha was through it in less than a minute. She was not a woman who gave herself long. She took the hand Agnes had offered and squeezed it once and let it go and straightened up and went to look at the calf. Deputy Sams arrived at 10 in the morning while the snow was still falling lightly, the exhausted remnant of the night's force. Agnes heard his horse and went to the barn door and looked out and recognized the way he sat in the saddle, careful and straight, a man who was always aware that he was visible. He tied his horse at the rail, which he had done before, and came toward the barn. Agnes stepped out to meet him. His face was not the same as it had been the first time he came. He had the look of a man who had made a decision somewhere on the road and was now going to see it through. Mrs. Morrow, he did not reach for his coat where the papers were. Reverend Crawford filed a formal petition yesterday with the circuit court. Petition for welfare inquiry regarding the children residing at your property. He paused. The circuit judge asked me to come out and make an assessment. Agnes looked at him steadily. Then come in and make it. She opened the barn door wide and let him see it. The calf standing on solid legs and clean straw. Ruth beside it talking to it quietly in the way she talked to Copper. The way children talk to animals, as though they have agreed beforehand that this is a private conversation. Caleb at the brazier heating water, his notebook on the shelf beside him, open to this morning's page. Eleanor moving along the feed row, checking levels, efficient and calm, and completely at home in the work. Walter and Martha Griggs standing near the north wall, Martha's hand on her husband's arm. Silas Tanner in the corner making coffee on the small camp stove he had brought in from his saddlebag because he had expected this to be a long night, and he had been right. Sam stood in the doorway and looked at it all. He looked for a long time. Then he reached into his coat, took out the folded document, and put it back. A child's personal effects are not estate property, he said. That is and has always been the law. You can tell Mr. Hollis I said so. He looked at Caleb, who was watching him with the direct attention that was the boy's particular quality. And the circuit court will receive my report that I visited Morrow Draw Ranch and found 2 children in good health, adequately housed and fed, engaged in productive work alongside responsible adults. He paused. That should close the welfare inquiry. Agnes said, and Reverend Crawford. Sams looked at her. The Reverend acted in good faith according to his understanding. My report will clarify his understanding. He stayed, not because anyone asked him to. He stayed because the storm had made the road back to Clearwater a poor choice for the next few hours, and because Agnes offered him coffee, and because the barn was warm, and the alternative was riding cold for 4 miles with nothing particular to look forward to at the other end. He sat on a hay bale with a cup in both hands and watched the calf and did not say much, which suited everyone. Before he left, he spent 2 hours splitting wood behind the barn. He did not ask if it was needed. He picked up the axe and started splitting, and he continued until there was a substantial pile of it stacked against the south wall of the house. He mounted and tipped his hat to Agnes and rode out. He did not explain the wood. Agnes did not ask. The storms continued through December and into January, not with the singular violence of that first one, but with the steady accumulating force of a Wyoming winter that has decided to be itself completely. The cold settled in and stayed. The pasture disappeared under 2 feet of snow. The creek froze from bank to bank. The barn held through all of it. The root cellar held. The haystack repositioned against the south fence lost nothing to moisture. The cattle ate well and lost no significant condition. The cattle count that Caleb wrote in his father's notebook at the end of each week stayed where it had been through November. Inside the house, Agnes and Eleanor settled into the rhythms of 2 people who have decided to share a space and have made the practical and emotional accommodations that such a decision requires. They did not talk about these accommodations. They were both women who found that doing was easier than discussing, and so they arranged their days through doing and left the discussing for the things that genuinely required words. Agnes began showing Caleb the ranch ledger in the evenings, not teaching him formally, simply opening it and talking through it the way you talk through a thing when you want someone to understand it from the inside. And Caleb listened and asked questions that were better than Agnes expected, informed by what his father had written and by his own 12 months of paying close attention to everything around him. He read both notebooks now, his father's and Samuel's, moving between them, and he would sometimes look up with an expression that meant he had found a place where the 2 men had arrived at the same answer by different roads. January became February without announcement the way months pass in a hard winter, one gray day at a time. Walter Griggs came back in the second week of February. He came without his wife and without ceremony and without any particular explanation. He tied his horse and came around to where Eleanor was working on the chicken house roof, replacing shingles that had taken damage in the January storms. He stood below the ladder and looked up at her for a moment. "My north wall," he said. "I redone it. Used what you told me." Eleanor kept working. "How did it take?" "Same as yours," Walter said. "Solid." He stayed for the rest of the afternoon and helped her finish the chicken house roof without being asked. He handed things up the ladder when she needed them and held the base when the wind came up, and he did not say much, but he was there, and being there was the thing. When they were done, Eleanor came down the ladder, and they stood looking at the repaired roof together. "My wife lost 17 head in 79, Walter said. "North wall." "I know," Eleanor said. Walter looked at her. "Martha told you." "Agnes did." Walter nodded slowly. He picked up his hat, which he had set on a fence post while he worked. "My wife knew it was going 2 winters before it went." He put his hat on. "I watched it instead of fixing it." Eleanor did not say anything. Walter looked at the chicken house roof. "The work you've done here is good work," he said. "I should have said that sooner." He said it plainly, the way a man says a thing that cost him something to arrive at, and then he got his horse and rode home. Eleanor stood in the yard after he had gone. Agnes was at the kitchen window. She watched Eleanor stand there for a moment looking at the road, and then bend down and pick up a fallen shingle from the ground and add it to the scrap pile, because there was always something that needed picking up, and Eleanor Vane was a woman who picked it up. Reverend Crawford came in the first week of March. The snow was still deep in the shaded places, but the south-facing slopes were beginning to show ground, and the light had changed that particular change that comes when the sun starts remembering what it is for. Crawford rode in and tied his horse and knocked at the kitchen door, and Agnes let him in and put the kettle on, and this time she moved his coat from the chair without being asked. He sat down. He looked at the kitchen, at the order of it, at the evidence of more than one person living here in a functioning way. He looked at Agnes's face, which she allowed him to look at because she had nothing in it she was hiding from anyone. "She earned it," Crawford said. He meant it as a real question, not the rhetorical kind. Agnes poured the tea. "She came here seeing what needed doing before I told her. She fixed what she could, and she found what I had missed, and she did not once ask me to tell her she was right." Agnes set the cup in front of him. "That is more than earned. That is something I did not know I was looking for until it arrived." Crawford wrapped his hands around the cup. He looked at it. "I acted from concern," he said. "I want you to understand that." "I do understand it," Agnes said. "I understood it at the time." He drank his tea, and they sat in a quiet that was not unfriendly. Before he left, he said that he would send word to the circuit court that the welfare inquiry should be formally closed and that he would speak to Garrett Hollis's attorney in Clearwater about the nature of a child's personal property under Wyoming territorial law. He said both these things in the tone of a man who has arrived through the long route at what he should have seen earlier and who is now going to do what that arrival requires. He went out to his horse and rode back down the lane, and Agnes watched him go with something that was not satisfaction exactly, but was adjacent to it. One afternoon in the third week of March, Agnes came in from the barn and went to the shelf where Samuel's ledger sat and took it down. She sat at the kitchen table with it. She opened it not to any particular page, but to the inside front cover, where Samuel had written his name and the date they had first taken possession of the land, and beside it the name Agnes Calloway Morrow, and the same date because Samuel had always said that a ranch was not one person's work, and the ledger should say so. Agnes looked at those names for a while. Then she went to the writing desk and took out the papers she had brought back from the county office in Clearwater. She had made the ride 3 weeks before the November storm, before the north wall was tested, before Walter arrived in the dark with a calf under his coat, before Caleb had shown her the last page of his father's notebook. She had gone while Eleanor was working on the haystack, and she had returned before supper. And she had said nothing about it because she had not been ready to say it yet, and because she understood that some decisions needed to be made in private before they could be made in the open. She had known that night at the gate when Eleanor said Samuel's words without knowing they were his words that something was different about the woman standing on her porch. She had not been certain what to do about that knowledge for several days. And then one evening, Eleanor had stood beside Agnes's haystack and said that most things that go wrong started out making sense. And Agnes had walked into the house and sat at her table and understood that she had been waiting 4 years for someone to say that to her and mean it the way Eleanor meant it, not as criticism, but as the plain recognition that time changes things and there is no failure in acknowledging it. She had gone to Clearwater the following week. She brought the papers to the kitchen table and set them next to Samuel's ledger and went to find Eleanor. Eleanor came in from the yard and saw the papers on the table and did not move for a moment. Then she came and sat down across from Agnes. Agnes pushed the papers toward her. Eleanor unfolded them. She read each page carefully the way she did everything carefully, giving each thing the full attention it deserved. She read without speaking. When she had read the last page, she set it down and looked at Agnes. Agnes was looking out the window at the windmill, which was turning steadily in the March wind, which was the right speed for that time of year, not the punishing wind of November, but the working wind of early spring, the kind that meant something was beginning. "If you choose to stay," Agnes said, "this place will someday become yours." Eleanor sat with this. Outside, Ruth called to Copper from somewhere near the garden, the dog's nails on the porch boards. "I won't promise perfect seasons," Eleanor said. "I know," Agnes said, "but I'll never stop caring for this land." Agnes looked at her then. She looked at Eleanor Vane's face, at the 34 years in it, at the road, and the loss and the work, at the quality of steadiness. That was not the steadiness of someone who has never been shaken, but the steadiness of someone who has been shaken many times and has learned where their feet are. "That's the only promise a ranch has ever needed," Agnes said. "Spring came in the way that spring comes in Wyoming. Not all at once, but in negotiations, a warm day followed by a cold one, then 2 warm days, then a frost, then a morning when you go outside and the air has changed, and you understand, without being told, that the negotiations are over." The creek came back. The pasture showed green beneath the last of the snow. The cattle moved differently, with the looseness of animals that understand the worst is behind them. Caleb spent the long evenings of early spring at the kitchen table with both notebooks open before him, moving between them. He was building something in his own separate pages, a document that drew from both, that took what his father had learned and what Samuel had known, and tried to put them in conversation with each other, organized by problem and solution, by season and circumstance. Agnes looked at it over his shoulder one evening and saw that it was more than a record. It was a working knowledge, a thing that could teach someone who had never met either man what those men had understood. He was 12 years old. Agnes did not say anything about what she saw. She simply went back to her chair and let him continue. One morning in early April, Ruth came across the yard at a speed that was unusual even for her, both hands cupped together, moving with the particular focus of a child transporting something that cannot be spilled. She came up the porch steps and through the kitchen door, and crossed to where Agnes was sitting and held out her hands. In them was a small pot barely bigger than a coffee cup packed with dark soil. From the center of the soil, a single stem had come up, and at the top of the stem, one small flower had opened orange and yellow. At the center, the color of the light that came through the kitchen window on winter mornings when it was trying to be warm and almost managing. Ruth put it into Agnes's hands. Agnes held it. She looked at the flower for a long time. Ruth stood watching her with the solemn patience of someone who has brought a gift they believe in and is willing to wait for it to be understood. "I planted it in December," Ruth said, "from the seeds in the jar on the shelf." Agnes looked at her. The seeds in the jar on the shelf had been there since the autumn of 1880. Agnes had put them there intending to plant them and had not planted them. And then the winter had come, and Samuel had died the following spring, and she had not thought about the seeds again. They had sat in that jar for 3 years. "They still worked," Ruth said. She seemed to find this worth mentioning. Agnes looked at the flower in her hands. She thought about 3-year-old seeds in a jar on a shelf and about a 6-year-old girl who had found them and believed in them and given them the care they needed, and about the difference between a thing that is gone and a thing that is only waiting. "Thank you," Agnes said. It was a simple thing to say, but she meant all of it. She set the pot on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light came in. It sat there in the light, and the flower stayed open, which flowers do when they have been given what they need, and the conditions around them have finally become what conditions should be. That evening, Caleb sat at the table with the ranch ledger open in front of him. He had asked Agnes the week before if he could write in it, and Agnes had said yes without hesitation, because the ledger was meant to be written in, and empty pages were a form of loss. He had a clean page open now, and he was writing in the same careful hand he brought to everything that mattered. He wrote the date. He wrote the cattle count, which was good. He wrote the state of the barn, which was sound. He wrote the state of the cellar, which was dry. He wrote the condition of the fences, which had come through the winter better than any winter in recent memory. Then he stopped. He looked at what he had written. He dipped the pen again and added one line at the bottom of the column smaller than the rest, set apart from the practical record above it. He wrote, "Pa was right about this valley." Agnes was sitting across the table and she saw what he wrote. She did not say anything about it, but she reached out and closed the ledger carefully, the way you close something that has what it needs in it now, and she left her hand resting on the cover for a moment before she took it away. Outside, the windmill turned. Copper lay on the porch in the last of the day's warmth. The pasture was green to the fence line, and beyond it to the hills, which were losing the last of their snow. In the upper reaches, the white retreating up the slopes, day by day the mountain showing itself again after the long covering. Morrow Draw Ranch did not sound the same in the evenings now. It had sounded for 4 years like a place that was managing. It had been a sound Agnes had gotten used to because she had no choice the sound of one person's competence maintaining what 2 people had built. Now it sounded like something different. It sounded like a place with people in it who intended to stay. It sounded like fires tended for tomorrow, and fences fixed for next decade, and seeds planted by someone young enough to see what grows from them. It sounded like the particular kind of continuity that is the only real victory available to people who work land, which is the victory of endurance, of being here still, of having prepared well enough that what you built survives the winters it was not certain would be survived. It sounded for the first time in a long time like a home that was not finished yet. That fall, a letter arrived at Morrow Draw. Agnes brought it in from the gate and set it on the table without opening it because it was addressed to Eleanor, and Eleanor was in the barn. When Eleanor came in and saw the envelope, she stood at the table and looked at it for a moment before she touched it. The return address was Cheyenne, not Garrett Hollis, a different name entirely. A man who wrote that he had ridden with Thomas Vane the day of the flood, that he had been on the far bank, that he had seen what happened all of it, and that there were things about that afternoon that Eleanor deserved to know, things about what Thomas had been trying to reach on the other side of the water and why. Eleanor held the letter and looked out the kitchen window at the pasture, at Caleb moving along the fence line in the low October light, at Ruth chasing Copper toward the barn, at the windmill, turning against a sky that was just beginning to collect the first clouds of another coming season. She sat down at the kitchen table and began to read.